Chapter 32 is a grab bag of grammatical miscellany. First, we begin with the formation of the adverb. Now, an adverb is a word that gives you more information about a verb, right? In English, we form most of our adverbs. The standard way to form an adverb is by adding ly to an adjective. Of course, we have other adverbs that just exist all by themselves, words like only or something like that. And there are some other adverbs that form like quickly, I suppose. But often we can just take it's become more and more acceptable to use adjectives applied to verbs directly without adding ly as an adverb. And there have always been some examples. You can walk slow, even though we also have the form slowly, right? So Latin has a basic way to form the adverb. That is, it's formed one way for first and second declension adjectives, and that is the addition of the letter e to the end. So longus becomes longe, right here. Liber becomes libre. Libere, I should say. And pulcher becomes pulcre. Note that with pulcher, even as you form the adjective, you drop the e, like other r-ending second declensions. Think back to puer and weir. Puer is a bad example, but think back to all the nominative singulars that have r, and in several of them you drop the sort of internal vowel. That's happening with pulcher. Here we have pulcri, so it goes pulcher, pulcra, pulcrum. For the adjective, here we have pulcre for the adverb. So that's first and second declension adjectives. And remember, all adjectives are either 1-2-1s, that is, they form their masculine two and twos. They form their masculine in the second, form their feminine in the first, and their neuter in the second. 2-1-2 adjectives, like longus, longa, longum. And then there's also third declension adjectives. And if you look back to the chapter, you'll find there's a lot. There's actually 3 different kinds of these. But that distinction, thankfully, doesn't much matter for adverbs. You form the adverb of a third declension adjective by adding ter or iter. So fortis becomes fortiter. Celer, meaning quick, becomes celeriter. Acer becomes acriter. Pretty straightforward. And there's this one quirk that is totally predictable, that is, if an adjective ends with nt already, you're not going to have ntter, so you just drop a t. So it just becomes sapienter. Pretty straightforward there. But Latin has this additional cool feature, which is it has comparative and superlative adverbs. Just like how we talked about adjectives in English have 3 states, 3 degrees is what we call them with adjectives. The positive, the comparative, and the superlative. Big, bigger, biggest. In Latin, you can do that with adverbs. English, we have to say something like more quickly, most quickly. We can't say quickly or quickliest for some reason. Latin, you can. The forms we've just discussed are the positives. The comparatives are formed with this ending ius. That's going to be very confusing for you for multiple reasons. First of all, it kind of looks like a second declension masculine, right? US at the end might make you think, is this some kind of noun? Reason number 2, it's confusing. If you get past that, you're like, oh, this isn't a noun, this looks like an adjective, look at the I there, this looks adjectival. Because it is adjectival, this is the neuter, nominative, and accusative of the comparative adjective, right? The comparative adjective of the 2 and 2 is usually formed by ior, I-O-R. That's the masculine and feminine version. The neuter was ius. You can go back and find this in your textbook, chapter 27. So, Latin uses the neuter accusative form of its comparative adjective as an adverb. This is actually a bigger rule. We'll find later that you can use accusative singular neuters as adverbs. Sometimes, just for fun. And that's what's going on here with the comparative. So the word diligentius is the one they gave, would be more diligently, rather diligently. More diligently than someone else. You could also imagine something like sapientius, more wisely. Wiselier is what it would mean, something like that. Then there's, of course, the superlative, which is used probably a little more, I'd say. Jucundissimi, so it's the ending issimi, which works most of the time, except for some verbs that have R's at the end. Sorry, some adjectives that have R's at the end are not formed with issimi, but iremi. So celerime means most quickly. Most quickly. Best way to familiarize yourself is to just read through this chart horizontally. That's what I would do. Right now, we're not practicing Latin composition. We are practicing reading, being able to recognize and read. So you want to familiarize yourself with these forms, learn to recognize these. So read across these, read them in Latin, and translate them for yourself to understand how they're used. There are these irregular verbs. These have come up already in our reading. These are the verbs wolo, nolo, and malo. And they're all derived from wolo. So wolo has this irregular four principal parts, wolo, wele, wolui. And this is the verb to wish. We get to wish or to will or to want. We get the English noun volition from this. Think of the words like voluntary, volunteer, words of volition, right? Of willing and wishing. Wolo, thankfully, has no passive forms. It doesn't really make sense to he is willed. Doesn't really make sense. So this is a defective verb. All the forms don't exist for this. And it's conjugated in a very irregular way. Look at wolo, wis, wolt. So wis, you need to watch out for. Looks like other words vaguely. Words like words for force and words for, I guess one could think of something to do with. I was thinking weird. Doesn't make sense there. Just watch out for it. It just means you wish, you will. Wolt. This is a famous Latin word from the phrase Deus vult, God wills it. It was a rallying cry during the Crusades to justify violence. And you'll scan across the forms here outside of the indicative. Now, modifying this is a very common word, so it's irregular, and the modifications of it are equally irregular. So you could, in theory, just say non-wolo, but you don't find that. They don't say non-wolo, they say nolo. They shorten it, contract it, I suppose, into nolo. Nolo, non-wis, non-wolt. Likewise, they don't say magis wolo, I want something more. They say malo. Malo, mawis, mawolt. This is a little bit unpredictable in places. For instance, non-wis for the second person singular, but mawis. Hard to remember how to produce these, easy to read, right? So learn these forms, be able to recognize this. If you know your patterns, you don't have to memorize all these individual words. Recognize what's going on with the stem, that there's some weirdness happening, and that these endings are going to follow your normal ending rules attached to some weird stem action. Okay? The imperatives here are worth knowing, that we use let me put this another way. To express a negative command, you don't negate an imperative. Instead, you take noli, and nolite for the plural, and attach it to an infinitive. So you don't say something like non mane, don't remain, that you don't talk that way. Instead, you use the imperative of noli, which doesn't really make sense. It'd be something like don't want. That doesn't really work. But nevertheless, you use the imperative of noli and attach it to the infinitive of the verb you want to negatively command. So if you want to tell someone not to walk, you say noli ambulare, right? If you want to tell multiple people, it'd be nolite ambulare. Important little paragraph here to make sure you don't skip. And then lastly, you have these proviso clauses. You can think of this as a new use of the subjunctive. It's often taught that way. Or you can remember that subjunctives are used for sort of conditionals and unreality things and, conditional type statements, things that are contingent, right? And what you find here is this word dumodo, which is a combination of two words, dum, which is a sort of temporal when then type word, and modo, which is an adverb meaning only, so it means something like when only, introduces a proviso clause, a condition that something else will happen. Often translated provided that or so that, so long as, sorry, not so that, so long as. And so, then that makes sense as a way of rendering when only. So I will, the example here, I shall not be afraid, non temebo, when only you remain here. Doesn't English, so you can't translate this directly. That's not a full mark answer. But you can hear what's going on conceptually. Better to translate this something like, I shall not be afraid, or I will not be afraid, if only, or provided that, or so long as you stay here. Hic remeneas. Remaneas. Good. So go look at those examples. Make sure to familiarize yourself with the vocabulary here, which is largely composed of the concepts being introduced. Wolo, malo, nolo, dumodo, and a few new words.